Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Phil Hoffman. Welcome to Pause. Coming up on this episode of Pause, we'll be talking about all the changes in the last decade or so in how you get your news. And we'll be joined by some guests from the Columbia Tribune. That's coming up on Pause. And welcome to Pause. And on this episode of Pause, we'll be talking about changes in the news business. And I'm glad to welcome today publisher of the Columbia Tribune, Vicki Russell, and managing editor, Jim Robertson. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
So let's just dig right into this. I mean, obviously the last, well, I guess forever really in the news business there's been change, but the last decade especially, it seems like it's been really accelerated. What's that been like?
Well, it's been like dancing as hard as we can to keep up, but you know, it's always been the case since I've been in newspapers for over 30 years, 37 years, is we started with IBM Selectric typewriters, and then we went to desktop CRTs and thought it was a moonshot, and then we were desktop PCs, and it's just been a progression of technology changes that make it in a lot of ways easier for us to do our job, and in a lot of ways more challenging.
In fact, when we look back at technology at the time Jim and I got started in the business, we sometimes scratch our heads and say, how did we get a newspaper out using that technology? But it's today it's just crazy, because every day there's the new next thing, and what was wonderful yesterday is gone. So it's a constant challenge trying to figure out what delivery mechanisms people might be interested in next, but at the same time, staying true to our core mission. And so even it's all about delivery now. It's not about the substance of what we do.
I would imagine in your position too, as publisher of the paper, I mean, the whole economic model has been thrown into an upheaval over the last few years. And so people are, I wonder if we've gotten so used to getting everything for free online that, you know, it's a big challenge to get folks to actually want to pay for content online. Certainly we've seen that with other newspapers. Has that been the case here with the Trib?
You know, when the Tribune made the transition to a paid model for our online delivery, our website delivery, we were told repeatedly before we did it that we were crazy to make that transition. In fact, we were one of the first dailies in the country to do it. But we were also looking at the model the way it was. You know, people have this idea that putting things online is free because we're already generating the news. How much can it cost to put it online? They neglected to think about all of the costs related to that. We have people who do nothing but deal with our online publications and mobile. We have licensing of software and technology that we have to buy to be able to have a good product to deliver in that way. So once we flipped the switch, it was really interesting because all of the criticism died down. We immediately got subscribers literally around the world. And the interesting and exciting part of that is we were delivering our news product to people who would never have seen it before if we were still just dealing with print. So even though there is a lot of upheaval, some of that opens up opportunities to us that we never had.
And certainly there's probably thousands and thousands and thousands of people who went to school here in Columbia who live all over the globe but are still interested in what's happening in Columbia.
Well,
have readers in every country but 2 in the world?
4, I think it is.
4, okay.
And those
North
are
Korea.
Chad. What are the others? Yeah. There are countries where people don't have access to the internet.
Fans.
Right, yeah, clearly.
Yeah. So I think, yes, we have lots of alums who come to school here, move away, or work here for a while, move away, and want to stay connected. But we also know that we have strong readership around the world of families of students who are on campus now. You know, they want to know what's going on in mid-Missouri.
Yeah, we have some of the most amazing online metrics that every time somebody takes a look at them, you know, they go, wow, how could this be? And we go, I don't know, you know, people, we just have engaged loyal readers, and they come from everywhere. So that's an advantage for us.
Part of that is true, of course, because this part of the world that we live in, even though, someone from a distance might think it's sort of a rural, bucolic area, it is a news crazy area. I mean, we're close to state government, and we have all the things that are going on in Columbia and Boone County and central Missouri. So I think there are a lot of people who come to our site to see how we are dealing with issues that are true in other areas as well.
Well, and it certainly seems to be the case that when you talk about the delivery mechanisms changing, the expectation today is much faster. Back in the day, when you were going to make a paper that would come out tomorrow, people were willing to wait till tomorrow. Not true now, right?
Sure. Oh, that's absolutely not true. We still have an afternoon newspaper, and people still we come in the morning actually, and we can watch as people log on when they get to work to check the headlines, because we update it at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then at 2 o'clock when we upload our afternoon newspaper, and then at 5 o'clock when they get home, just to check headlines again. So they expect new content then, and we do our best to deliver it. We had 24 hours between production cycles, and now it's constant.
An interesting element to all of this is that even with the alternative distribution methods, people still prefer print. We know lots of people from the habits that they explain to us, look at our updates, really value our news alerts. But then they expect to see the full complement of the Tribune when they look at us in the afternoons on weekdays and the mornings on weekends.
Well, I know it probably makes me sound like a dinosaur, but I still want to have the physical product. I know I can look on my iPad and swipe, but I want the paper product in my hand. There's something about that.
And I think, and you're not unlike most people, I think. And in fact, there are studies that show that even college students who you might expect would be the digital consumers, digital natives, they prefer textbooks that are ink and paper. And I think if they'd try a newspaper, they would too. It's just, there's something about the tactile experience and many things that are different than reading a digital.
And I will say, with the Tribune, I've literally never had the battery die.
Yeah,
Looking at the paper. So good job.
Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting thing. You talk about digital natives, and I think there's sort of maybe it's common knowledge more so than anything that's really researched. There's an idea out there that they're not really interested in news. And if they have an interest in news, it's entertainment news, not anything that's substantive. What have you found in your work?
I think there's more made of that today than is deserved, because I think the news habits of today's young people are about the same as they were when I was a kid and when my parents were kids. You tend to be interested in the things that you are connected with. So if it's entertainment or sports or the arts, we had a student group visit not long ago, well, a while back, and we were asking them, did they read the Tribune print edition? Most of them did. They had it in their homes. And we asked what they preferred to read. And the first student to raise his hand, these were high school kids, said he was crazy about our art section on Sundays. Wouldn't have been my first guess.
Right.
So I think it's what the kids relate to. I think when people become older and become more invested in their communities, they have homes, they have kids in schools, they want to know a whole lot more about what's happening in the community, and then their behavior changes.
Well, and certainly one of the things that I always was frustrated as a former television reporter, I apologize, I'm recovering, but I was always frustrated with the fact that maybe the less sexy stories were the ones that touched everybody, but we would go out and shoot a fire or a car wreck over, say, a complicated story about a sewer project that was literally going to affect everybody in the city. So I think that's the other thing that it seems like you have to balance is what's really important, really, for people in the city versus what do people like to see.
Sure, sure. We struggle with that balance every day, trying to get it right, and we like to say they've got to eat their broccoli too. And that's the day in and day out incremental reporting we do on city government and state government, and I think our readers are pretty responsive to that. Of course, they like. Crime and weather are always good news topics, and we get. If there's a high-profile murder, we sell a lot of newspapers, but that doesn't mean we want more murders. We want more city council stories.
Right.
And very big, interesting change in the news gathering business today is who those reporters are on the front line. We hear a lot about newspapers downsizing, but what a lot of people sometimes don't know is that newsrooms have virtually disappeared from most radio stations. And in commercial, in Columbia, we have the unique addition of the journalism school. So I'm talking more about privately held news media. Television stations have reduced staffing. So many times the only reporter sitting in the room at 2 a.m. when the council meeting is over is a newspaper reporter. And if there is broadcast coverage, it's typically for one snippet of one part of the meeting, and then those reporters are gone. So it's, I think, very important for newspapers to try to maintain that role as watchdog, because we're pretty much the only ones doing it at a local level.
And certainly my experience as a television reporter bears that out, because I can tell you, we would sit there first thing in the morning at the meeting looking at the newspaper. And oftentimes it was almost literally ripping the story out and saying, okay, you cover this, after the paper had already covered it very effectively. So I definitely have seen those downsizing things that have happened in electronic media have definitely had an impact on the ability to report.
And it's the Tribune is an important economic engine for Columbia, and certainly for the owners. But what Vicki's talking about, us sitting through the city council meeting until 2 a.m., that's important for democracy too. And if we don't do it, nobody's going to. So, it's people, I think, don't think of the importance of newspapers in that way often enough.
Well, in today's day and age, that person also could be sitting there till 2 a.m., a blogger. And while perhaps that blogger understands balance and fairness and everything, it might also be that they're there because they have a particular point of view.
An agenda.
Right. And so I think that's the other thing, and we talked about this a little bit before we started taping, about social media today, and how do you select your sources, and how do you know what's really a trustworthy source?
Yeah. Well, we use the tools of social media. We tweet and we post Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and all that. I don't think we're doing any Snapchat, but we'll figure it out. And, the one thing that is a steadfast rule that we will not depart from is that we are in the business of verification and documentation. So we're not going to tweet out something that we have not confirmed. And in fact, our policy is to have a brief or a breaking news bulletin on our website before we tweet anything out, so that we have a chance to do some confirmation. If we don't do that, I mean, there's no advantage to reading us over the blogger.
Right.
So that's one of the rules that we think is very important.
Plus, the other thing we have is archives that go back for more than a century, so we can verify things from our coverage in the past, and we have strict requirements about getting a variety of sources, so that we are not just reporting what we think. We are finding out what the impact might be to a variety of people with different perspectives.
And that's not, I certainly wouldn't say that aren't any bloggers that are doing that, but that's not an expectation of a blogger. It's just sort of a different animal, don't you think?
Oh, I think so.
It's the reaction of the writer.
Right.
Yeah. And so the multiple sources, we understand it's hard to get to the absolute truth in a news story, but so you try to come at it from as many angles as you can, try to add context and perspective and history background, and by doing that, you get as close to the truth as humanly possible.
And the challenge.
And when we don't get as close to the truth as some people think we should, we have so many ways for them to share their opinions and reactions about it.
They're not shy.
I imagine you hear
Yeah,
from time to time
in
from
multiple
readers.
ways.
Well, it's the other thing that's interesting to me is the dynamic of because you're trying to do things the way that you believe is the right way to do them, that can slow you down.
Yes.
And so making sure that it's right can also make you maybe a little bit later than some other sources.
It happens. You know, we because we are professional journalists in this town who have been doing it for a while, we know where to go to get verification or to, you know, get the flag going up. And so we're able to do that pretty quickly and get something out. Our goal is to be first and to be right.
Right.
So as long as those two can live together, we do fine. And our audience, you know, we've been around here for over 110 years. Our audience comes to us first, so that's an advantage for us.
And we recognize that if we break that trust, if we don't make it right while trying to be first, that audience will go away. They won't know whether to believe in us or not. And on those occasions when we do make a mistake, I think we are, in newspapers as a rule, are the first to correct errors.
Yep.
For one reason, we have the best archives of what happens.
Right.
Archives historians will depend on in the future, and we want to make sure that we are not feeding them bad information.
So earlier we were talking a little bit about the change in the newsroom itself. And Jim, you were talking about how much more quiet it is nowadays. How did that come to pass?
Well, back in the old days when AP was delivered through teletype, we put rolls of paper on that every morning, and every time a breaking story would come through, there'd be bells, ding, ding,
right.
ding, ding,
I
ding.
remember the bells.
And, you know, the chatter of the typewriter, constant, and it was, you know, as you would imagine on a TV movie about, you know, the front page or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that just kind of, it raised the ambient noise level in the newsroom, so everything else was a little louder, you know. Mm-hmm. The editors yelled a little louder, and the reporters sobbed a little louder because they were being yelled at. And then all of a sudden we changed from the typewriter and the teletype to a really silent, not digital at that point, but it was a lot quieter technology. And it's just been getting just gradually worse and worse until it feels like a morgue in there. It's quiet. It's like an insurance office because everybody, you know, we even have soft tone telephones. So that is one of the things that I miss.
Right.
But other things take its place. You know?
Well, and certainly with a change in the mobility for reporters now, they can be out, and you probably
sure.
want them to be out as
Sure.
opposed to being in the
That's
office.
right. We want them in there to get their stories done in the morning for the afternoon paper, and then they should be out beating the streets for news, talking to their sources and going to events, and that's by and large what happens. Yeah, we have you know, the news cycle is not only spread out over 24 hours, but there's so much happening as far as government meetings and events and interesting lectures and this and that. So we have people working, you know, from daylight to midnight most days.
There's a lot, if you think about a city the size of Columbia, and of course you're also serving the surrounding areas as well, there's a lot to try to cover on any given day. And those things that you're trying to cover, also you have to think about, as we talked about earlier, the longer term stories, the
Sure.
things that you're doing sort of like a little bit at a time over a much longer time period. And I would imagine, like most organizations, you don't have the same size staff that you had 50 years ago or 30 years ago, right?
You know, no, but I have to say that we have dodged that bullet. We have kept staff levels pretty well constant. You know, back in the 2007, 2008, when the economy went bad, a lot of newspapers that are chain newspapers or newspapers that have debt, they got in real trouble, and the first thing they did was cut the news staff, which we've always thought is the last thing you should cut. And thank goodness the Tribune management and owners agreed with that. So we've been pretty constant. Yeah.
In fact, we did a survey not long ago, and the Tribune's newsroom, not counting journalism schools, is, at the time we did the survey, we have the biggest newsroom across all media, north of Little Rock, south of Des Moines, and between Kansas City and St. Louis in the state, even though we're the 5th largest city.
Well, and there's no question, to me, that's a commitment that you have made.
Absolutely.
Because it's not that these other folks couldn't have done that. They could have. They just
They
elected
made
not to.
different choices.
Right. I think
And part of that is because they have to answer to shareholders.
right.
And we are very fortunate to have local family ownership, which is pretty rare in today's newspaper world. The last count I saw, there were fewer than 75 independently owned daily newspapers left in the United States. Most dailies these days are owned by corporations.
And this is my opinion, you don't need to respond to this, but I think that's good for a city to have local ownership of their media outlet, especially a newspaper, because the newspaper can be so influential in what folks think is happening in town.
Absolutely, and that is the case. And we do so much more in Columbia than cover news. We do cover news the best that anybody does. New York Times can't touch us in Columbia. But Vicki can tell you the many other things that the Tribune is involved in the community.
Oh my gosh, well, we sponsor many activities. We initiate recognition events for leaders in our community in different categories. It's a three-ring circus. But I think the most valuable part of local ownership is that when somebody calls the Tribune and they want to talk to someone in a management position, they talk to us. Our doors are open. We get lots of feedback, and that helps us be more thoughtful about what we do every single day. We are part of the community. We see people at the grocery store. We interact with people all the time, and I think that makes us much closer to better understanding what the community wants and needs from us. Plus, we have more local columnists than most, even much bigger newspapers. And as I hinted at earlier, we have so many ways for people to communicate with us. So it helps us really understand our audience much better.
Well, and certainly somebody that's remote from the market that they're serving, it's easier to sort of misunderstand or even dismiss comments from local readers rather than actually understand where they're coming from.
Right, exactly. And if we can, do something to address their comments in the way we do things.
So I know you're probably working on this, Jim. We're getting towards that time of year. It's the end of the year. Are you guys starting to work on the top stories of the year for Columbia?
Well, sure, but I think we've got a few to go yet.
Yeah.
You never know. That's always a fun project.
Absolutely. Every year at the end of the year, I can recall we would always start looking backward and trying to look at what happened, and inevitably there was something that happened in December that nobody anticipated. That
Exactly.
would be a huge story.
Yeah.
When you are working with that kind of thing, and you're looking backwards, and you have your staff there, the fact that you have folks who've been with the Trib for a while, probably very helpful because they can again overlay that context.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. And plus we have a great archives, so we can not only reconstruct what happened 6 months ago, we can say how it relates to something happened 10 years ago, and that kind of perspective helps our readers and helps us.
Well, I have to admit, as a former TV guy, I used to get really annoyed with you print guys because you would sit there and ask everything and write it all down and make sure you get it all right. But it was interesting because we would only keep, at our station, that day's newscast and nothing else. So when you went back to try to reconstruct something, you had
Didn't
minute.
have much to work with.
Right, you
that's
had
right.
very little to work with. So in terms of the information, we always would go to our friends at the newspaper and say, hey, can we look at your archive?
You know, I've noticed that.
Yeah.
about you broadcast guys.
I apologize. As I said, I'm recovering.
That still happens.
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
And we're happy to share.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Just don't see our notes.
Well, we have a couple minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about, for folks who want to see what's going on in the Trib, where do they go? What's the website? If they're interested in subscribing to the paper, how do they make that happen?
The website is columbiatribune.com. And of course, they can reach us by calling our offices at 573-815-1500. They can email us on our website. There's contact information. So
Great.
we're happy to hear from people.
And there's always a paper in the store somewhere, so
You
you
know,
can always
yep.
make that happen.
Buy your paper every day, and you'll know exactly how to get in touch with us.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. Again, Vicki Russell and Jim Robertson from the Columbia Tribune. And that's it for this episode of Pause. We'll see you next time.